Hello, Cleveland. Welcome to another episode of the 1085 Gridiron Podcast. I am your host, Anthony Joki. Today, we will be talking about the Browns' new head coaching hire. They have hired Vikings offensive coordinator Kevin Stefanski as the team's 18th overall head coach and 10th full-time head coach since they come back to the league since 1999. As always, I have Jack McCurry breaking this down with me today. How you doing today, Jack?
Doing well. Nice to see that this coaching search is over because the last few days have been crazy, especially if you're on Twitter. So glad that the search is over and we can finally start talking about who the head coach actually is.
Yeah, these things on Twitter and pretty much everywhere, sports talk shows, sports talk radio, it gets very tiring. And as a fan base that has gone through this quite a bit over the course of the last 20 years, it's been very exhausting. And with them being the last team to hire a head coach, it got really exhausting. And, it's nice that we actually have a decision. They decided to go with Kevin Stefanski. But before we get to him, Jack, let's talk about some of the top guys that were in the running, were some of the finalists, but didn't get hired. Those were Robert Saleh of the San Francisco 49ers. Supposedly Brian Daboll impressed as well. He's the Bills offensive coordinator. And then there's Josh McDaniels, the offensive coordinator of the New England Patriots. Jack, when you look at those three guys and you look at Kevin Stefanski as a whole, they for once, I think, stuck to the process that they had within this organization. I know Haslam talked about it in his press conference to where, they went through this entire process last year. Reportedly, DePodesta wanted Stefanski, but they decided to go with Freddie, and that was kind of Dorsey flexing his muscle a little bit. But when you look at those three guys, I think they're all good candidates. I think, McDaniels was my personal favorite and the guy who I thought should have been the head coach, but they decided to go with Stefanski. What do you think about those three guys being the finalists for the job?
Yeah, I mean, McDaniels was my personal favorite too, and going through all the way through Friday night, I mean, it seemed like it was going to be McDaniels, but as Saturday continued to drag on and there was no announcement yet, it seemed like things had changed, and you could see some people were reporting that DePodesta was going to win out, and they were talking a lot more about Stefanski and Salah a lot more. So, and while I was still holding out hope that it was going to be McDaniels, but at the end of the day, like, my opinion clearly doesn't matter. None of the fans' opinions matter. It's all about what the committee wanted. And it was clear that, DePodesta, even though his contract was running out, I would imagine he's going to be getting a new one here soon. He was running the process, and it seemed like the Haslams were going to go with him and what his choice was after not listening to him the previous two searches. I thought Salah, especially yesterday in the divisional round matchup against Minnesota, he called a great game. Albeit he has a ton of talent on that defensive side of the ball, but he coached a way better game than Stefanski did, but you don't base it on just one game. You look at the entire body of work, and I definitely did not want Brian Daboll. I don't see why the Browns liked him and why he was a supposed dark horse. I mean, he's done some good work with Josh Allen. He looked a lot better in year 2 than he did in year 1, but I just don't get the fascination with him. Maybe, we'll find out why he impressed so well that he was a rumored dark horse, but they stuck to the process. We'll talk about McDaniels here in a second about the alleged reports, but they stuck to the process and they came away with the same guy again in Stefanski. And, you can't argue what the Browns did here, although, it does rub some people the wrong way because the trend was going towards McDaniels, but ultimately it's Stefanski.
Yeah, let's talk more about McDaniels because, along with him being your favorite, he was my personal favorite. The reports are he wanted to make sweeping a sweeping overhaul of the Browns front office, and that would include getting rid of the guy who would essentially be hiring him in DePodesta. Obviously, they didn't decide to go that route. What do you make of Haslam, DePodesta not going with Josh McDaniels, someone who wanted to kind of revamp everything, versus going with Stefanski, who I would imagine the reports are that he's going to bring in Andrew Berry as a general manager and kind of keep things the same. It's almost like a plug-and-play scenario where the guys that are already there are bringing in the head coach to fit what they already have, and they didn't want to make overhauling changes with McDaniels.
Yeah, I mean, it seemed like no matter what, DePodesta was going to be here. And I just don't think that, and there was reports even saying this, that McDaniels and DePodesta would not coexist. I think McDaniels wanted to essentially run everything and put the people in place himself. He didn't want to have that other person here on the side trying to make recommendations like DePodesta would do, and is still likely going to do for the Browns. I can't fault the Haslams for not wanting to make sweeping changes. And based on their track record, Haslam was probably going to meddle no matter what. So I don't think he was ready to relinquish everything over to somebody. Even though he's wanted McDaniels for so long, he clearly doesn't know him well enough to trust him. And right now it seems like he trusts DePodesta. So, I mean, we'll see how this all shakes out. Like I said, I'm disappointed that McDaniels isn't the head coach, but we have to live with that. He's clearly going to go back to New England unless, looking at this game we're watching right now, Houston, maybe there's something there if they get rid of Bill O'Brien that he gets his opportunity to be a head coach again. But, I mean, would sweeping everything out and bringing in everything new been bad option for Cleveland? Probably not, because what the Haslams have done since they took it over hasn't been great. But, I don't know. I mean, it is what it is. We can't hamper on it. If this doesn't work out, obviously the Haslams will make changes again, and maybe McDaniels will be available the next time we fire a head coach or fire a GM or whatever. So just got to move on at this point.
Yeah, they already started to make sweeping changes when they let Dorsey go. They started to kind of realign everything, but I guess they wanted to realign with certain pieces that were already there and not go full bore into completely reorganizing the whole thing. And since that's the case, we end up with Kevin Stefanski. Now, the thing that gets me about all this is, they wanted to hire a head coach with experience, and let's run down Kevin's history as a coach, because he hasn't been a head coach before, but he's been in the league for a very long time. In 2006, he was hired as an assistant to the head coach for the Minnesota Vikings, which I believe was Brad Childress. In 2009, he was promoted to assistant quarterbacks coach. Then he went to be the tight end coach in 2014. In 2016, he was a running backs coach. Next year, he was the quarterbacks coach in 2017. Halfway through the 2018 season, he became the interim offensive coordinator. From there, he interviewed with the Browns last offseason. Browns went with Freddie. Stefanski went back to Minnesota to be the full-time offensive coordinator. And now he is hired by the Browns. So he's been in the Vikings organization for the last 13, 14 years. So he's been in the NFL a very long time, but there is no experience with him being a head coach. When you look at what he's done with the Vikings offense for the last year and a half, you could argue that he's done a very good job with it. That's why he's in the position that he's in now. Is there a fear with you, Jack, of not having that experience that they kind of put in their criteria that we talked about?
To a degree, yeah. But at the end of the day, and, this was a thing that was getting misquoted throughout the day, Jimmy Haslam said he wanted NFL experience. He never said an experienced NFL head coach. He said they were looking for a coach that had NFL experience. And if they were looking for an experienced NFL head coach, they would have gotten rid of Freddie earlier and tried to make a push for Ron Rivera. The whole Mike McCarthy thing, it's apparent that was never going to happen. Even though he says he's changed, if you read some of the stuff that's come out now since he's been hired by Dallas, it shows that he is still clueless when it comes to analytics and data analysis and all that. So McCarthy wasn't going to be the answer. So it was clear that they were going to either, get Josh McDaniels or they were going to hire a first-time head coach again. The thing I like about Stefanski, he was there in Minnesota during these 14 years under 3 different regimes. Brad Childress for the first few years, then transitioned to Leslie Frazier, and then most recently with Mike Zimmer. Like, obviously, whoever has come in as a new head coach in Minnesota has liked Stefanski's work ethic, his ability to adapt, willingness to adapt and change to things. And obviously, he's done a good job. I mean, he's coached multiple positions. He has the same type of resume as Freddie Kitchens, only he has had more work with the quarterbacks, has had success with the quarterbacks, and like I said, the willingness to adapt, the willingness to change. I think that separated him last year in the process, and why DePodesta wanted to hire him over Freddie Kitchens, and now why it's put him ahead of everybody else, except maybe a Josh McDaniels, to be the head coach of the Cleveland Browns.
Yeah, there was a nice article that I read from the Star Tribune. I think it was the Minnesota Star Tribune about when last year when Kubiak came in, Gary Kubiak came in. Stefanski was very willing to learn Kubiak's terminology. He didn't want to confuse the 4 coaches that came in who were all on the same page and used their own terminology by using his. So what Stefanski did was he learned their terminology. And that just kind of speaks to the learner that Stefanski is, the willingness to adapt, which why there's many around the league and many around the media that consider him one of those young top offensive minds like a Sean McVay. Now, it didn't work yesterday against the San Francisco 49ers, but one game isn't going to change the result of an entire body of work, and I think that premise that it would is entirely stupid. Going up against Saleh, who was the other candidate for the Browns job, and the Vikings, the 49ers defense. But the way Stefanski has been able to put together this entire body of work, adapt to different offenses that he's learned over the course of 13 years with the Minnesota Vikings under multiple people, there's a wealth of knowledge up there to where I think he has a good grasp on what works, what doesn't work, what he still needs to explore and learn. And when he's experienced so many different types of personnel in terms of players and even coaches for that matter, there are many different guys here in Cleveland, in terms of players that maybe he could just come in and adapt his system to the players that are already here. So that way we're not rehauling and retooling an entire offense. You stick with the guys that are already here and have them fit towards what they're best at.
Yeah, I mean, that is one good thing about Stefanski. I mean, you mentioned that article and the fact that, Kubiak, his son, the offensive line coach and the tight ends coach came in, and instead of having them adapt to what Stefanski had already implemented, he said, no, I want to learn what you guys were doing. And I think that's a great thing. And you mentioned the players. I mean, this was one of the things when Freddie Kitchens had taken over as offensive coordinator, he went to the players and said, what plays do you guys like to run out of, I think it was Todd Haley's playbook? He goes, we'll implement that into what I want to run. And that's what made the offense successful, and that's ultimately what Kitchens did. And then he wasn't willing to adapt to what Todd Monken wanted to bring in as the offensive coordinator. And I think, if Stefanski sticks to what he was doing, and, there's no sense of if he's going to be calling the plays here. It's been speculated, but it's clearly unknown at this point because he hasn't even been officially named head coach, and there hasn't been the press conference. But if he comes in and is still willing to adapt, willing to change, and willing to listen to the players on what they like offensively, as well as, defensively, whoever they bring as a defensive coordinator as well, I mean, that can only be a good thing. He's definitely a great communicator by all accounts from what I've been able to read so far about him. So if he's going to be the same person as he was, working his way up as an assistant coach and as an offensive coordinator, and he's willing to listen, he's willing to grow and change to what people like, then he could be a good head coach. Only time will tell, though.
We'll eventually do like a full statistical breakdown on here at some point, but one of the things I wanted to quickly compare, and these are some of the things that I've tweeted out earlier today, is the personnel usage in Minnesota is much more balanced, and same with the run-pass ratio is much more balanced than it was in Cleveland this past year under Freddie Kitchens. So the Browns ran 11 personnel, which is 1 running back, 1 tight end, 3 wide receivers, for 554 plays, which was 57% of their entire plays for the season. They ran 12 personnel 23% of the time, 21 personnel 6% of the time. I know it doesn't equal 100, but there's many other personnel groupings. Those were just some of the common ones. The Vikings ran 11 personnel 22%, 12 personnel, 1 running back, 2 tight ends, 35% of the time, and 21 personnel, 2 running backs, 1 tight end, 22% of the time. So when you look at that, Jack, there's a much more even balance between those different personnel groupings, and it showed overall as well the run-pass ratio. The Browns had a 40% run to 60% pass ratio, and the Vikings had a 49% run to 51% pass ratio. So all those different things that Stefanski has learned over the years, he has certainly learned, at least this past season, as his first full season as an offensive coordinator. Things were extremely balanced, and that is something that coaches really strive to go for because it keeps the defense guessing when you're balanced kind of down the middle. They don't know what you're going to be coming out with next.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, and you look at the personnel that he had to work with in Minnesota. I mean, it is just as talented as what Cleveland had. I mean, you had Dalvin Cook at running back, who's going to the Pro Bowl, had a great season, 1,100 yards, 13 touchdowns. You had Stephon Diggs and Adam Thielen at wide receiver. Granted, Thielen was hurt about half the season. He had 2 solid tight ends in Rudolph and Smith Jr. I mean, he's come into Cleveland and he's got Nick Chubb and Kareem Hunt at running back, Odell Beckham and Jarvis Landry at receiver, and then he's got Njoku at tight end. So hopefully, that relationship can get resurrected with a fresh start with a new head coach. But just as much talent in Cleveland as he had in Minnesota, and I think it fits what they did schematically in Minnesota is what they could do in Cleveland. So, the potential's there to have just as a dominant offense in Cleveland as he did in Minnesota. Just have to upgrade the offensive line, definitely, though. Yeah,
I think that's the major thing. That's kind of the same problem that the Vikings struggled with this season, too, was kind of a beat-up offensive line. Dalvin Cook still had a really decent year, having over 1,000 yards on the ground. He also put up over 500 yards receiving as well. So he was able to have a very nice season, and there's hope to believe that Nick Chubb is definitely somebody that's going to benefit from Stefanski's willingness to run, willingness to throw it to the running back. I'm sure somewhere Tony Grossi is smiling because of their usage of a fullback. That will definitely be coming back to the Browns offense as well. It'd be curious to see how the Browns tight end situation shakes out with the Vikings' willingness to use two tight ends constantly. With how much they ran the ball, blocking tight ends is something that's going to be a big point of emphasis come free agency, come the draft. Hopefully that's something that Njoku can improve upon this offseason is his blocking and catching the football too. He needs to work on that. But, there's certainly hope when it comes to this Browns offense that, there's talent here. Stefanski, I would think, knows how to use it pretty well based on his previous experience, in just this 1 year. But you look at guys who had good seasons in Minnesota this year, Stephon Diggs, Dalvin Cook, like we mentioned. Those guys had very good seasons with the Vikings making the playoffs as well. So there's certainly opportunity for this Browns offense to excel next season. And I think the expectations are going to be high if the majority of the personnel in terms of players stays the same. You expect Baker to grow as a quarterback next year. You expect other guys to be healthy, like Odell, like Landry. They're going to improve the offensive line at some point, whether that be the draft or free agency. So the offense is going to improve, and hopefully the result on the field is that they will improve as well. Let's talk about, you mentioned play calling, and we don't know, and it hasn't been reported, if Stefanski is going to be calling plays or not, but we want to look at potential offensive coordinators for the Browns that they could go after in Stefanski's new coaching staff. So a few guys that we have, I guess, number one, you could put Kubiak up there since he has had such an influence in Minnesota under Stefanski, Gary Kubiak. And I would definitely put him at the top of the list. Mike LaFleur, is it Mike LaFleur or Matt LaFleur? Is it Matt?
Yeah, it's Mike LaFleur.
Mike, okay. Because they're both Mikes that are coming up. Mike LaFleur, who is the 49ers passing game coordinator. He is the brother of the head coach up in Green Bay. Mike McDaniel, who is a 49ers running game coordinator, is also an opportunity. All these guys, Kubiak, LaFleur, and McDaniel, have worked under Shanahan. Kubiak worked under Mike Shanahan, and then LaFleur obviously working under Kyle in San Francisco. So, Jack, when you look at these three guys, and feel free to bring up any other name that you think of, who do you see potentially coming in as offensive coordinator, and do you think that Stefanski would be willing to give up play calling to this person?
I definitely think he would. I mean, his willingness to do anything practically shows that he could be willing to give up the play calling. I mean, only time will tell. I'm sure once we hear the introductory press conference, that'll be one of the first few questions. McDaniel and LaFleur have been mentioned the last couple of days. I think Benjamin Albright has been the one to report that. Maybe even, Gary Kubiak makes a lot of sense, obviously. Right now he's the assistant head coach over there as well as an offensive assistant. So, if they name him the offensive coordinator as well as assistant head coach, maybe that could get him to leave Minnesota. It's just a matter of Mike Zimmer's willingness to do that, to let him go. Gary's son, Clint, who is the QB coach in Minnesota, that could be another potential option. McDaniel and LaFleur are definitely the top guys I would go after. Try to get one of them, try to get them in place, and then once the 49ers playoff run's done, they can come join Cleveland. Both have worked in Cleveland before when Shanahan was here. Another name that's being thrown out, I just seen on Twitter, was Norv Turner. And Lane Atkins even said this: Norv Turner has no desire to come to Cleveland, even though that could be a potential fit. If you guys remember from when Chudzinski got fired, Norv Turner reportedly blew up at Jimmy Haslam and Joe Banner. So don't expect that marriage to ever happen again in Cleveland.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of interesting names, and there's chatter that maybe all those guys that we mentioned could be joining the Browns in some capacity on the offensive staff. I think that would be quite a coup if Stefanski can pull in both Kubiaks and LaFleur and McDaniels onto the offensive staff. A couple of those guys could be quarterbacks coach, running backs coach. We'll see who the offensive coordinator would be, but that could certainly be a home run for Stefanski if he's able to pull all those guys into this coaching staff. On the defensive side, Jack, there has been a lot of talk that potentially Steve Wilks could remain as the defensive coordinator for the Browns. What do you think of him potentially remaining as the defensive coordinator for at least another year?
Yeah, Mary Kay Cabot is reporting that Wilks would have been Stefanski's choice last year had he been named head coach. Wilks had a tough year, there's no doubt about it, but he also dealt with a lot of injuries. The lack of depth, especially on the defensive line when Myles Garrett got suspended, really hurt, and including Olivier Verdon's injuries as well. I wouldn't mind him coming back for another year, granted that the Browns do add some depth on the defensive side of the ball. Continuity is not a bad thing to have, but he needs to be willing to change. He runs a lot of zone coverage. You have two corners that are better off as man-to-man. So if you're not willing to switch, maybe the Browns should go in another direction. And just so we're bringing it up, there's reports out there that Jimmy wants Stefanski and whoever the GM's going to be show some willingness to keep some of the guys. If they want to keep them, that's fine, but do not force guys to stay. Do not force guys on Stefanski and whoever the GM is. That has been Jimmy's problem since he's taken over his ownership. He tries to force things together that aren't good fits. He's doing it over and over again. It's the definition of insanity. Stop doing that, Jimmy. Let the people that you hire put the people they want to work with around them. Don't try to force things. That's why you are not a good owner, and that's why the Browns have been terrible under your ownership.
Is there anybody else, in terms of defensive coordinators, Jack, that you could see potentially fitting here under Stefanski?
No, the only name that I've seen is George Edwards, who is the Vikings defensive coordinator. His contract expires, it says, at the end of the season, so I would imagine he's a free agent currently. So that's the only other name that I could see right now. There hasn't been any rumors or reports about potential defensive coordinators, but that's one that comes to mind immediately.
What would you think of somebody like Wade Phillips, who has worked with Kubiak before and is familiar with somebody like him? I know he's 70 years old, but he did a good job in Los Angeles before getting the boot this offseason. What do you think of somebody like Wade Phillips potentially joining this coaching staff? Especially for a first-time head coach who is going to have a lot on his plate, and Phillips being a guy who has experienced all these things before.
Wouldn't be a bad option. He struggled this year in LA for sure. That's why they obviously went in another direction. Like you said, he's 70. Who knows how long he's going to keep coaching. I wouldn't mind bringing him in here for a couple years if he had someone to groom underneath him to eventually take over. Granted, Stefanski makes it a couple years just because of our recent history, but I wouldn't mind him. I mean, his track record speaks for himself. He should definitely go in the Hall of Fame for what he's done as a coach. So I'm open to anything on that side of the ball, definitely.
we kind of assume, and maybe it's wrong of us to do this, but we kind of assume that Mike Prefer will be back because he was a special teams coordinator in Minnesota when Stefanski was there. So we kind of expect that to kind of stay the same. Hopefully those two had a good working relationship. I know the Browns improved tremendously this season in the special teams department, in large part by their two rookie kickers, Seibert and Jamie Gillen. So we'll see if Prefer is somebody that Stefanski wants to continue to have as the special teams coordinator. Now,
Cleveland.com is reporting that Prefer will be back. So obviously their relationship's good, and Stefanski wants to keep him around. So that's a good move.
Yeah, I believe so as well. Now comes the fun part in hiring a general manager. The Browns have requested and interview Andrew Berry from the Philadelphia Eagles. There's been reports out that they are actually going to hire him as a general manager. Jack, when you look at bringing Andrew Berry back into this organization to be the general manager of a front office, what do you think of that potential hire in terms of personnel that is already here player-wise? And what do you think Berry would bring to this front office that currently does not have a GM?
It would bring alignment, which has been like the key word during the beginning of the offseason for the Browns. Is they want to have everybody on the same page. Obviously, Berry came in when DePodesta and Sashi took over the front office 4 years ago now. Very bright, very smart football guys. Berry was here up until Dorsey took over. Then, he was here during 2018, and then last year went to Philadelphia, became the VP of football operations. I'm sure learned more under Howie Roseman, and now is, being looked at as a potential GM candidate. I had to laugh, though, because today, Aaron Goldhammer said that when Andrew Berry was here, the Browns picked up no good football players. Myles Garrett, David Njoku, Larry Ogunjobi, Rashard Higgins, Joe Schobert, not to mention Carl Nassib, Emmanuel Ogbah, Jabril Peppers, and Zane Gonzalez, who are contributing elsewhere. And then we have at least 3 guys on the Browns roster currently that are good players. And then we have 2 that are going to be free agents this offseason. So I think Berry can come here, be the GM, be in lockstep with Stefanski, who they're reportedly friends. And obviously the connection with Berry and DePodesta. I don't have a problem with it. I mean, if they are going to do this where they have full analytics as well as football, I mean, you can't go wrong bringing Andrew Berry in as the next GM.
Now, nothing has been said about Elliott Wolf and Alonzo Highsmith. The thing with the University of Miami kind of fell through for Highsmith, and currently he's still with the organization. What do you see happening with those two gentlemen if Andrew Berry comes here and is the general manager of this team?
Well, like I mentioned on my little rant a couple minutes ago about them wanting to keep people in the front office and the coaching staff. If Andrew Berry comes in, wants to work, and got along with Highsmith and Wolf the first time, which I have my doubts about, I don't get the sense of why keeping them here. I think Highsmith's gone regardless, just because, that's been out there since Dorsey got let go, that Highsmith was on his way out. He's not going back to the U. That fell through. Wolf, I mean, I would keep him, but like I said, I don't want to force things together. Like if Andrew Berry wants to bring in his own assistant GMs or directors of player personnel that share the same philosophies he does, that's fine. Like, you can't mesh philosophies together if everybody's not on the same page. Like, that's the point of emphasis I'm trying to get with Jimmy Haslam. Like, it didn't work with Hugh and Sashi. It didn't work with Dorsey and DePodesta. Why do you keep trying to make this crap work when it's clearly not? If they're not sharing the same style of philosophies and can't be on the same page, it's just not going to work.
Is there now, if Barry does come here, is there anybody that you could see him potentially bringing in terms of like an assistant general manager, or maybe even somebody above him, and like a president of football ops or something? Or is Andrew Barry going to be the end all be all on the football side?
I'll be honest, I have no clue about that. I'd have to do some research to see like who he's worked with in his time in Indy, his time here, and the year in Philadelphia as potential options that he could bring along with him as assistants, or like you said, someone to oversee the entire football operations. But I can't name anybody off the top of my head at this point.
Would you be opposed to him finding somebody to be kind of in charge or anything above him, or do you think for now that's kind of DePodesta's role?
It's too bad Sashi Brown's working for the Washington Wizards, because that's who I'd bring back.
Oh, Jack. Oh, boy. Oh, good God. All right. On that note,
if we're going full analytics and doing this, why not bring Sashi back if he would be willing to? Clearly, he wouldn't, because Jimmy fired him. But why couldn't he come back in a hypothetical scenario and just be the guy that oversees everything?
On that note, I'm not going to dive into that one. Is there anything else you want to discuss before you get on out of here that's not Sashi Brown related?
Nope, I'm good, buddy.
All right. Well, as always, you guys can follow Jack on Twitter at JMcCurryCLE. You can follow me on Twitter at Anthony Joki, Joki. Be sure to follow the podcast and the website on Twitter as well at The Dogland. We've, I think, done a fantastic job covering this head coaching search, and between podcasts and the website. So we appreciate everybody that's listened, everybody that's read us. We really, truly appreciate it. With all that, we're going to get on out of here. You can find our podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, and Google Play. We have a new head coach finally. We'll see when the optimism kicks in for everybody, when the hype starts to build. Until then, go Browns.